If you or someone you know has a story, encounter, or experience you would like to share with my viewers, please send it to my email at stories@whatlurksbeneath.com. Thank you. This encounter goes back to 1999 when I was out in the western section of Johnston County, Oklahoma. This occurred just a little ways east of Highway 177. It was also winter outside, and I was out bobcat hunting at the time. I was more of a casual hunter then. I just enjoyed being out there in the country, seeing everything there was to see. It wasn't too much time later until I entered into this thickly wooded pasture. This pasture was very, very full of brush. At the time, I was much more of a novice hunter and thought it would lead me to a catch. After walking a ways, I remember getting a very strange sensation. I decided to explore a little more, and the feeling kept getting stronger and stronger. By this point, there were several pathways in the thick brush that looked like they were made from a very large animal. There were several of these paths forking at multiple random different points. So, I randomly followed a couple of them to the very end. The very last one led me to what I can only describe as an animal den. It was a fairly small clearing in the thick brush, no more than 20 to 30 meters around, and all around me was hair, dried blood, and bones. So many bones. I'll never forget it. I'll never forget the smell either. Animal urine, wet dog, rotting meat, and blood. It was an absolute mess of a smell. It is forever burned into my nostrils. I stood there for a moment intaking my surroundings and felt that uncomfortable feeling get really strong again. I got out of there pretty quick and decided to call it quits for the day. I know out here we got lots of critters, but I ain't ever seen no animal den like that one. Something in my gut just told me it wasn't right. I'm 29 and currently am renting a really old piece of property. See, I moved out here from the city because the rent in town is so dang expensive. I wasn't having it. Plus, I really wanted land and peace and quiet. After looking for a while, I found this house that I'm currently renting. It's basically an old farmhouse from the early 1900s that's been renovated and added onto over the course of time. It's a cozy little place. What's even better is all the cool stuff I have lying around my property from years and years ago. Hell, I even have a piece of an old Model T frame out in the acreage that was used as target practice many years ago. Whatever I've been experiencing all has to do with an old homestead that was built on this piece of property a very long time ago. It's practically falling apart due to not being kept up on, but was used for ranch hands to stay in. Judging by the wear and tear of the building, I would say at least 60 plus years. This building is probably about 100 yards from my house, and somehow, this building still has a couple of running shop outlets, and so I keep my big meat freezer in one of them. The door may be old, but it's heavily locked with a huge fat padlock, and the handle also has a padlock. I want to deter anyone from getting in there, as well as any potential threatening animals. I keep pounds and pounds of good meat in this freezer. Deer, pig, chicken, beef, lamb, you name it. I usually stock up for months and just keep all my meat in it. Here's another important piece of information. We don't got nothing out here that big. Deer and cougar are about the biggest animals out here in these woods. We have no bears or wolves anywhere. I'm kind of tucked away in the mountains a little bit, around 1,500 foot elevation, so I don't have to deal with many nuisances, except maybe coyotes. So what happened to me is, after getting up one morning and doing what I normally do, which is make coffee, etc., I noticed the homestead door was wide open. I thought it was bizarre since it had been days since I was in there, and I always keep it double locked. I thought something had happened, so I run over there, and the first thing I notice is my freezer on its side. what looks to be like it was picked up and thrown across the room on its side. The meat I had was partially devoured on the ground, with tons of meat missing. What the fuck? I thought. I inspected further but could not find any tracks, hair, smell, or evidence of any animal or person breaking into this thing. I noticed something else that was really weird. Both my big heavy-duty padlocks were gone. Not cut, not torn off, just gone. I searched and couldn't find them anywhere around the door or the homestead. Since it was cold outside and the meat was still partially frozen, I did my best to try and pick up my chest freezer and put what I had left back in. What disturbs me is this chest freezer is huge, and it's a heavy SOB. It's incredibly bulky and hard for me to move as just one person. I don't know what animal could have not only picked it up off the ground, but threw it across this huge room. And the partially devoured meat too. This meat was frozen and something came and ate it. These were huge chunks taken out of this meat, so I'm truly baffled still as to what might have happened. Like I said, we have 0 bears around here. That was the only time I've ever had a strange experience here, but since then I stopped keeping meat in that homestead and moved my meat freezer into my shop. Since then, I have not had any real problems. Not mine, but my brother's encounter. Before I tell you more, let me just say that my brother is a total bamf. He's trained in MMA, has served in the military for years. He even did 2 tours to Iraq, etc. He's a tough man, and when someone like him tells me this story and expresses how scared he was, it scared me shitless. My bro didn't even know these kinds of things existed until I told him about it. And he told me he actually had an encounter with one of these things I described him. This happened around 2010 or 2011. He had gone to visit a couple of his army buddies in Kentucky somewhere. I assume it was pretty rural. They got together, drank a bunch of good beer, had a good cookout, and then decided to end the evening and rode their ATVs around his friend's property. He was riding along with his 3 other buddies and had reached the end of the property line by this large creek that runs throughout his friend's land. He said he began to hear weird crunching noises in the leaves and began to feel like he was being watched. His buddies quickly pulled up, and they all got the same sensation. Since these are all military dudes, they were already ready for something or anything to go down, and it felt, and they thought, like somebody was sneaking around. My brother explains to me that not even 20 feet away, from behind a tree, out steps what he can only describe as a werewolf in the living flesh. He said it looked like it straight up stepped off the movie screen and was now standing in front of them, staring intently at my brother, who happened to be the closest to this thing. My brother's gut instantly knotted up. For what my brother tells me, it felt like an eternity in this locked stare down between him and this creature when his friends screamed at him to go, and they haul ass away on their ATVs, praying this thing didn't follow them or chase. He said he never looked back once to see if this animal had been following them. Since his friend's property was rather large, it took them a little bit to get back to his house, where my brother was so panicked it took a while for his friends to calm him down. All 4 of them saw it, but my brother feels like it affected him differently. He said this thing did something to him. It marked him, as he calls it. It never once took its eyes off of him to look at his other 3 buddies. He said it was hard to describe what this thing looked like exactly, just that it looked like a real life werewolf. Said it had huge pointed teeth, was about his height, with brown blackish thick fur, stood up on 2 legs and was tapered at the waist. He got really shooken up about it when he told me it, and just telling his story gives me the massive chills. Let me just start out by saying I am an experienced outdoorsman. I have been a lover of the outdoors since I was just a wee lad. In fact, I even ended up purchasing property when I got a little bit older, just so I can go turkey hunting on it and not worry about competition or other people around me. Luckily for me, the property in which I purchased was usually full of turkeys come around springtime. For those that aren't familiar with turkey hunting season, it happens in the spring. This property that I purchased is about 56 acres of land. The geography isn't too complex. It's flat for quite some while, but then slopes down slowly with lots of thick locust trees, very rocky with occasional brush here and there. I've been using this spot for years to call in and to snag myself a good Thanksgiving tom. I've been successful just about every year. I can count on my one hand the times that I haven't gotten anything. Unfortunately, in the past couple of years, I've had to abandon this property and spot altogether due to a problem that was beginning to get out of hand. This is why I'm writing to you. It started about 4 years ago when I showed up in late May one day. It was early morning and a beautiful day. I was confident I would snag myself a good-sized tom. When I pulled into the property, I'm surrounded by large open pastures on all sides, and beyond that is thick wilderness with the slope that I talked about earlier. I usually start by calling them in and waiting by my truck before I can get a good shot. I called them in and waited and waited. I thought it was odd that this time I wasn't hearing any noises or seeing any movement through my binoculars. This was rather unusual, so I decided to get a little bit closer. I tried calling them in again, closer to the woodline, and again, silence. There was nothing. It was eerily quiet. Something was off, and I couldn't quite tell what it was. I decided to venture a bit further to see if I could hear anything. Not even 300 yards into the woodline, I began feeling this tremendous amount of anxiety and stress. I don't know how else to put it. It was like pins and needles. I threw my binoculars up and looked around to see if maybe I can spot a turkey or something around. And as I'm moving my binoculars in full rotation, at about 10 o'clock, I met with a pair of amber eyes staring right in my direction. Since I'm looking through my binoculars, I can't really discern how big these eyes are or what animal they belong to, but it freaked me out. I pulled my binoculars down. About a few hundred yards away down the slope, this massive dark shape with what I can only make out to be pointed ears at the top was staring right in my direction. I watched it intently for a few moments as it stood perfectly still facing me. I began to slowly back away, not knowing really what kind of animal I was dealing with firsthand. In a few moments, I had to back my way all the way to the woodline. This thing was now out of sight since it had never moved, but still kept looking in my direction. I quickly walked back to my truck, and as I'm about halfway to the truck, I hear branches breaking and brush moving rapidly. Something big was coming out of the woods toward me. Whatever it was sounded like it was very heavy and weighed hundreds of pounds. I picked up my pace back toward my truck, and by the time I reached my truck, it was only maybe 2 minutes later at most. I quickly turned around and put my binoculars up to see if I could spot anything. This is the only time I've ever soiled myself. Coming out of the woodline, headed in my direction, was this massive thing of an animal. I don't know what to call it because I've never seen anything like it. It had large pointed ears and a head that reminded me somewhat of a German Shepherd. It was hundreds of yards away, but in my binoculars, I could see the finer details. It had huge canines, glowing amber eyes. This thing was solid black and you could clearly see the muscles rippling underneath the fur. This was probably the most muscular animal I have ever seen in my life, and looks like a flat-out killing machine. I took in more details of the face than any other part of the body, and I could see that it was clearly walking on 2 legs toward me, quickly. It had legs just like a dog, and a thinner waist. I only got a good look at this thing for only a few seconds before it was really picking up speed towards my truck and me. I have never been so scared in my life. I flew in my truck and drove out of there. Ended up not going back to the spot for the rest of the season, but I did return the following year. The following year I came about earlier May or so. I got out of my truck and again, like last year, noticed really no turkey activity at all. I figured that unlike last year, I would just walk close to the woodline and see if I can maybe call them out. I was still fearful of the year prior and have not forgotten, but I was not going to let that stop me from doing what I love. As I'm approaching the woodline, every step I feel more and more dread. The exact same pins and needles feeling that I got the year before in the woods. By the time I finally approached the woodline, I just told myself screw it. I did not want to risk running into that animal that I did the year before. I left and just ended up turkey hunting with another friend in the area. I haven't gone back to that property out of fear that this animal might be lurking and waiting for somebody to return. Maybe this predator is the reason there hasn't been any turkeys in the area. I don't really tell this story to anybody, but I thought your listeners might enjoy it. I'm not claiming to have seen this so-called Dogman, but I definitely saw something that I cannot explain. All I know is I have never seen or heard anything like it, and it scared me to the point of releasing my inner self into my pants, so to speak. If you're somebody who's tough and enjoys the outdoors, I thoroughly encourage you to not speak of this animal, and to not seek it out, or try to hunt it, or go looking for it. I will never be able to accurately describe the feeling that came over me when I saw this thing coming out of the woodline directly at me and my truck. I don't wish that upon anybody. Maybe at some point I'll return and this thing will be gone for good, and my turkeys, my precious turkeys, will finally be back. So, this is actually my father's encounter, back when he used to be a police officer in the late 1980s. He claims that he encountered some kind of monster, and that this thing attacked his cop car while responding to an emergency call. Where he was at, he had to drive through a more rural part of town to get where he was going, and he said that out of the side of the road, this thing leapt out at his car and slashed the shit out of the side of the car, and hit his car so hard that he almost spun off into a ditch where this thing supposedly came from. He said somehow, miraculously, he regained control of the vehicle and hauled ass even faster. He says he has no idea what it was and that he only caught a quick glimpse of it. He said it was very large, dark colored with massive amounts of teeth that shined in his headlights. It came up and out of the ditch and ran right towards his car, hitting it right behind the driver's side, knocking his car almost off the road. He said he thinks it was following him for a little while he was doing at least 80 to 90 miles an hour on this lone road, trying to escape and outrun it. He ended up making it to the call, obviously. With his job, he could not report it to his supervisor. He did not want to risk his employment or any sort of ridicule from his boss or coworkers. He's kept that encounter for a very long time. I've tried to ask my father more about what he saw, and asked him if he believes it could have been a werewolf or even a dogman. See, my father is a man of science and doesn't really give in to the idea of paranormal, werewolves, creatures, or any of that sort of thing. Even though it may have looked like one of those things, he just says that it was some sort of monster he couldn't describe. He never dealt with anything like that ever again, nor did anyone on the force that he knew of. This is kind of a different encounter. By different, I mean it had a very positive effect on my life in a very weird sense. Let me explain. At the time this happened, I was 19 years old. I was going through a very tumultuous time in my life. My mother had just been murdered 6 months prior, and as the case evolved more and more evidence appeared, it turned out that my own father was the murderer. They had a pretty rocky relationship for most of my early years as a child before finally splitting in a nasty divorce at the age of 11. My father was always very angry and spiteful against my mother and would do anything to make her life a living hell. As far as I know, there was minimal amounts of contact between them, and I never really saw my father much after the divorce. On top of that, I was drinking heavily and dealing with a lot of depression issues and wanted to kill myself. And that's just what I set out to do, to end it all. I remember it clear as day. It was a Saturday night in August, and I had planned to go walk down to the train tracks where there is a dike running alongside of it, and lay my head down on the tracks to let the train come and take care of me. That was my plan anyway. It was around midnight when I walked down to the tracks. It was fairly quiet with minimal people around. There was a slight breeze and everything was fairly dead. As I approached a segment of train tracks that didn't really have any traffic or people around anywhere I could see, I started to approach the tracks from the dike when I heard a low growl behind me from the trees. Immediately I felt panic rise up my spine. I turned around and standing there is the werewolf from the Van Helsing movie. Not exactly, but it looked really close to that thing. I was so startled and scared, I started screaming, and this thing cocked its head back and looked at me like a confused dog would do. I'm still screaming, and as this thing looks at me for a quick moment, it then disappears off into the night. As soon as it bolts, I run as fast as I could back to where I was staying at the time. I just sat in my bedroom and cried the rest of the night, trying to process my life, my desire for suicide, and what I just saw. It really messed me up even more, but then I realized after some time that maybe it was meant to happen to me, because had that creature not popped out from the trees, I would have ended my life. Weeks after that encounter happened, I was so bogged up in trying to explain to myself what I saw that I kind of put my dark feelings aside, and it almost made me forget about my life. I tried to look into it, and what it is I saw something pointing to Bigfoot, but I knew that werewolves and those kind of things didn't exist. But I later ended up learning that it was indeed a Dogman. I look back at the whole thing now, and I really believe it was meant to happen to stop me from killing myself. I doubt you get many encounters that are like the one I had, but know to those that hear or read this that sometimes things happen for a reason, and maybe there's a reason we've all had experiences with this particular being. Close friend of mine at the time lost her dog while out and about near Lake Pines in Louisiana. This thing is a huge reservoir on a bayou and is very beautiful, but somehow this friend of mine lost her dog, like I said. This dog was very important to her, and she had lost him days prior and wanted my help to see if I can't help find him. For those that are not familiar with the Lake Pines, there's a lot of thick brush and woods around the area, since this was June. We had gone out exploring in the evening in the area that she believes where her dog had ran off. She told me before we went that she had been exploring other parts of the park to look for him, but to no avail. We went in with flashlights and headlamps since it was getting darker, and we looked for what only seemed like hours. You have to understand, this dog was everything to my friend. I've known her for a long time, and I remember when she got this dog as a puppy. She was never married or really had much family, so this dog was kind of all she had. So, as her friend, I felt morally obligated to help her find this poor dog. It was dark when we found her dog's collar that looked like it had been chewed off. She was starting to panic, thinking that something has seriously happened to her dog, when I tried to encourage her that maybe her dog isn't far, and we should just keep looking a little while longer. That is, until we ran into the Lugaroo. I always thought it was just a legend until that night. I know this might be a very cliche thing to say, but it's honest to God's truth. We were in the thick at this point, but we came to a small little clearing where you could get into the water. It was so dark out though that you could not see without flashlights. At some point, we heard something big splashing around very close to us, so we turned and shined our lights towards the water. I gasp, and my friend starts to scream. "What is that thing?" I don't know what terrifies me more thinking back to it. Its eyes, or the fact that it had dried blood all over its muzzle and chest. This thing immediately lowered its head and let out the most evil, menacing growl I've ever heard in my life. This thing looked like it came from the pits of hell. It had a very demonic-looking face that looked like a dog standing up on two legs. It was very lanky and shaggy, but it had razor-sharp teeth and huge black claws. If I had to estimate, it was roughly 7 feet tall. We were about 30 or so feet away from it, and it was standing knee-deep in the water. I don't know why it was there, or if it was planning on sneaking up on us, or if it was stalking us, or what. Whatever the reason, it did not like the fact that we discovered its presence. I don't think we shined the light on it for more than 2 seconds before I grabbed her and we ran and we ran. We jumped in her car and we drove away, and we never spoke of it really after that. We were both so shooken up that I don't even think we were in a state to even talk. When we got back to her house, we just sat there in the car together in silence for probably close to 30 minutes before she finally said that she doesn't ever think we'll find her dog. I think the Lugaroo got to it, but I'll never know for sure. I still have nightmares about that night to this day, and no, she never ended up finding her dog.